The secret opera singer. Every morning, Tom Bridge got up at 5 a.m. He washed himself as best he could in the bucket of cold water that stood on the plain wooden table by the window. He got dressed, had a slice of toast if there was any bread left over that morning, and he left the tiny one-roomed flat that he lived in with his mum and dad. He made his way along the street past dozens of other buildings containing flats just like the one he lived in, and he crossed in front of the theatre on the way to the aeroplane factory. It was 1940, and Tom had left school at the age of 14 to bring home a wage. There were plenty of jobs going at the factory. More aeroplanes were needed because of the war. It was noisy, dirty, tiring, hard work and long hours, but Tom enjoyed it. All day the machines rattled and clattered. But the workers kept their spirits up by singing along with the rhythm of the machinery, and that made time pass quickly. On the way home, he would pass by one of his favourite places in Ipswich, the theatre. As a young boy, he would stop to watch the other children playing outside the theatre. His family were too poor to buy him toys, but there was always a friend to share what they had with him. It was one hot summer's day when he was about 10 years old that he heard the most wonderful sound coming from within the theatre. Often the sounds of rehearsals could be heard outside, but Tom had never heard anything like this before. It sounded as if there was an angel singing. Knowing he could never afford a ticket to the theatre, he sneaked around the back to see if there would be a window open that he could climb in through. And he was in luck. Once in the theatre, he followed the sound along corridors and upstairs until he could see the stage from a high-up, dusty platform above. On the stage was a lady and a man in old-fashioned costumes, and they were singing to each other in a foreign language. He had never heard anyone sing like that before, but he loved it. Tom had discovered opera.
Shine.
From then on, Tom would sing whenever he could, including in the old tin bath in front of the fire. His parents were incredibly proud of him, but they didn't have the money to send him to a musical school. So at the age of 14, off he went to work in Temper's aeronautical factory. Temper's was owned by one William B. Temper, a very rich man who wasn't at all pleasant to his staff. Still, they kept their spirits up by singing while they worked and keeping silent whenever Mr. Temper or his horrid son, Harold J. Temper, looked out over the factory floor. Harold was the same age as Tom and was going to a very expensive school. He would take the opportunity to make nasty remarks about Tom's shabby appearance whenever he passed, and he would play mean tricks on him, like putting salt in his tea. One day, the staff heard some good news. The famous music hall entertainer, Lawrence Orwell, was making a visit to the factory. Lawrence Orwell was one of the most popular singers in the country and was planning to do a tour to take his uplifting, morale-boosting songs to the troops and then to stages and village halls across the country. Temper's factory was making an aeroplane just for the tour, which would transport Lawrence's band, dancers, and the whole production team. Lawrence's visit was going to be filmed by newsreel crews, and top Fleet Street journalists and photographers would be there to see him arrive at the factory. Stories like this kept the public's morale up during a war. The day before he arrived, an artist had been painting Lawrence's face on the side of the new plane. As he arrived in a posh car and stepped out onto a red carpet, Mr. Temper stepped towards Lawrence Orwell and shook his hand. The cameras filmed them talking and then followed them into the factory. It was so noisy in the factory that the workers hadn't heard them come in, and the factory workers were singing loudly along to the rhythm of the machinery, and Tom's beautiful operatic voice could be heard above them all. "Wait, who is that? I want to meet the owner of that beautiful voice," cried Lawrence over the sound of the machines. Immediately, Mr. Temper strode over to the wall and flicked the switch that turned everything off. The workers stopped singing and lined up immediately. "Oh," Mr. Temper smiled. "Why, that was my very own son, Harold. Sings like an angel, he does. An angel."
"Harold, get up here now,"
he shouted. Immediately, Harold strutted past the workers, pouring a packet of itching powder over Tom as he went.
"Yeah, Papa,"
he announced, bounding up to Lawrence and getting all of the attention from the press. While Harold was talking to Lawrence Orwell, Mr. Temper, who knew full well that the beautiful singing voice belonged to Tom, grabbed him and pulled him behind a machine. "Right, boy," he growled. "This is my son's chance for fame. And if you ruin it for him by showing off your lovely voice near Mr. Lawrence, you'll get the sack and no wages at all this month. Understood?" Tom was scratching furiously from the itching powder and was terrified by Mr. Temper, so of course he agreed. Heading back out towards Lawrence Orwell, Mr. Temper rubbed his hands together gleefully. "I say, old boy, I have a rather splendid idea. How about you hold a concert here at my factory to start off your tour? And if you allow my boy here to sing, I'll knock 20% off of the cost of the plane. What do you say?" Orwell and Temper shook on it, and the photographers' cameras flashed. It made front-page news. A few weeks later, the plane was ready, and the huge hangar next to the factory had been set up with a stage with an expensive-looking red curtain, all for the big concert. All the factory workers and their families were invited, and the press were there to record the big event. Lawrence Orwell opened up the concert with one of his biggest hits, and the crowd all sang along. All his songs were so uplifting, and they cheered people up during difficult times. After another couple of songs, Lawrence gestured to the cheering audience for silence. "I would now like you to meet a great new singer who I met on my first visit to the wonderful factory. Please welcome to the stage, young Master Harold Temper." Horrible Harold strutted onto the stage to the applause of most of the audience. But the workers from the factory were not clapping so enthusiastically. They were all sitting right next to Tom, who they knew was the one whose voice Lawrence had really admired. The band struck up, and a lovely singing voice was coming from the stage. Certainly it was nothing like Tom's beautiful operatic voice, but it wasn't bad at all. Harold was enjoying getting all the attention and was strutting around the stage, posing and showing off. His father was smiling smugly at the side of the stage. But then a funny thing happened. One line of the song just repeated and repeated and repeated. Harold had a wild look of panic upon his face. Slowly, people in the audience started to realise what was happening. The lovely singing voice didn't belong to Harold at all. There was a record playing behind the curtain, and Harold was only miming to the song. The audience watched in shock as Mr. Temper dashed behind the curtain to see to the record player, but it was too late. Harold attempted to finish the song in his own voice, but it sounded terrible.
Simon, la la la. La la la.
And he was booed off the stage.
Boo! Go on, Richard. Boo!
There was a very uncomfortable pause while everybody could hear Harold and his father arguing behind the curtain. Lawrence Orwell stepped back onto the stage to try to save the show. Well, folks, sorry about that. It rather looks as if our wonderful new singer was not what he seemed. It looks like we're going to have to cut the show short. No, wait! Cried someone in the audience. It was one of the factory workers. Get Tom up there! He can sing better than anyone! It's him you heard at the factory, not Harold. Lawrence smiled and looked down into the audience where the factory workers were getting Tom to his feet and they were pushing him towards the stage. Go on, Tom! They cried. Tom grinned and climbed up onto the stage. Lawrence said, Well, Tom, will you give us a song? Just then, Mr. Temper came out from in behind the curtain. What are you doing, boy? Get back down there! No, said Lawrence.
I am here, I must sing.
Well, Tom got up on stage and sang his heart out. When he finished, the audience brought the house down with their applause. The factory workers were cheering, and Tom's parents were so proud of their wonderful son. Tom went on tour with Lawrence Orwell using his full name, Thomas Saxon Bridge, and he enjoyed fame and fortune for the rest of his life.